The Silent Sins of St. Mary Mead, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins in the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead, where every smiling face hides a story, and some hide far worse. Beneath the peaceful gardens, polite greetings, and afternoon teas lie secrets the village has kept buried for years. When a troubling event shakes the calm of the community, Miss Marple begins to notice the silence surrounding certain names, certain places, and certain memories no one wishes to revisit. Because the greatest danger in St. Mary Mead is not what people say, but what they refuse to speak about. Before we uncover the silent sins hidden within the village, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales.
Chapter 1. The Bells of St. Mary Mead. The rain had started just after supper. Not a proper storm, mind you. Just a thin, cold drizzle that clung to the windows and turned the village lanes black beneath the lamps. St. Mary Mead looked peaceful enough from the outside, curtains drawn, fires glowing softly behind frosted glass. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and then went quiet again. The sort of evening that made people lock their doors early and pretend the world beyond them didn't exist. Miss Marple sat near the fire with her knitting folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't reading, wasn't speaking, only listening. The bells of the church drifted through the damp air, low and hollow, carrying across the village like a warning nobody wished to hear. 3 slow chimes, a pause, then one final bell that seemed to hang in the darkness longer than it should have. She glanced towards the window. "That's odd," she murmured softly. Church bells at that hour usually meant one thing: trouble. An hour later there came a sharp knock at her front door, not polite, not patient either, the sort of knock made by somebody badly shaken. When Miss Marple opened it, she found Mrs. Ellis standing beneath the rain with her coat half-buttoned and her face pale as candle wax. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, "it's happened again." Those 4 words settled heavily in the room. Again. Miss Marple invited her inside without another question. Mrs. Ellis trembled as she removed her gloves, though whether from cold or fear was difficult to say. Her eyes kept darting towards the windows, as though someone might be standing outside in the rain, listening. They found him in the churchyard, near the old stone wall behind St. Mary's. Miss Marple's needles stopped moving. "Him?" she asked. Mrs. Ellis swallowed hard. "Mr. Raymond Pike." For a moment, only the fire crackled. Raymond Pike had not been loved in St. Mary Mead, a wealthy man with slick manners and sharp little smiles. He collected secrets the way some men collected stamps. Quiet rumors followed him through the village lanes, affairs, gambling debts, letters that vanished. People lowered their voices whenever his name was spoken, and now he was dead. The churchyard was already crowded when Miss Marple arrived the next morning. Rainwater clung to the crooked gravestones, and the muddy ground carried the footprints of nervous villagers. Nobody spoke above a whisper, not near the body. Raymond Pike lay beside the stone wall with his coat soaked through and one hand curled tightly against his chest. His face carried a strange expression. Not pain, fear, pure fear. Inspector Graves stood nearby with a cigarette hanging untouched between his fingers. He gave Miss Marple a tired look as she approached. "Bad business," he muttered. "They usually are," she replied calmly. The inspector leaned closer. No wounds, no sign of robbery. Doctor says his heart gave out, but there's something odd about it." Miss Marple said nothing. Inspector Graves lowered his voice further. "Before he died, somebody heard Pike shouting inside the church, screaming apparently. Said he kept repeating the same sentence over and over." "What sentence?" The inspector hesitated. Then he looked towards the ancient church doors standing dark beneath the grey sky. "He said," the inspector whispered, "the sins are not buried, they're waiting." And somewhere above them, deep inside the church tower, one lonely bell began to ring again.
Chapter 2. Whispers under the church floor. The rain finally stopped by evening, but the village still felt soaked in something colder than water. Fear had a way of settling into St. Mary Mead quietly. It slipped beneath doors, sat beside supper tables, and followed people home from church without making a sound. Nobody spoke openly about Raymond Pike's death, not properly. They whispered instead, behind shop counters, outside the bakers', in little corners of the village where voices stayed low and eyes kept shifting nervously towards St. Mary's Church. Miss Marple noticed all of it. By Thursday afternoon, Miss Marple found herself standing inside the church beside Inspector Graves. The old building smelled of damp wood and candle smoke. Faint light slipped through the colored windows, staining the stone floor red and blue like bruises. "It happened somewhere near the altar," the inspector said quietly. "That's where the verger heard Pike shouting." Miss Marple glanced slowly around the church. The place looked peaceful enough. Rows of empty pews, hymn books resting neatly in their holders, a small vase of dying flowers beneath the cross. But something felt wrong, very wrong. Her eyes drifted towards the floor near the altar steps. Tiny scratches marked the stone there, fresh enough to notice if one looked carefully. "Has this church been repaired recently?" Miss Marple asked. Inspector Graves frowned. "Not that I know of." Miss Marple bent slightly, studying the marks. "Someone's moved something heavy." The inspector gave her a curious look, though before he could answer, the church door creaked open behind them. Reverend Colby entered slowly, his face pale beneath the dim light. He looked exhausted, not from grief, from nerves. "You shouldn't disturb the church floor," he said sharply. The suddenness of his voice startled even the inspector. Miss Marple looked up gently. "Only observing, Reverend." Colby forced a weak smile, though his hands remained tightly clasped together. "The village is frightened enough already. Rumors spread quickly after a death." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "especially when people feel guilty." For one brief moment the Reverend's expression changed. A flicker only, but she saw it. Fear. That evening, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Ellis once again. The poor woman nearly dropped her teacup when Miss Marple mentioned the church. "I told Raymond not to go digging into old matters," Mrs. Ellis whispered, "but he never listened." "Old matters?" asked Miss Marple. Mrs. Ellis leaned closer, lowering her voice until it barely rose above the ticking clock. "The night before Raymond died, he told me he'd found proof." "Proof of what?" Mrs. Ellis swallowed hard. "That Clara Whitmore never left St. Mary Mead at all." Silence settled heavily between them. Then, from somewhere across the village, the church bells began ringing again, slow, hollow, uneven. Miss Marple stared into the fire as the sound echoed through the dark, and quietly, almost to herself, she said, "Dead girls rarely stay silent forever."
Chapter 3. The Sins That Would Not Stay Buried. The storm returned on Saturday night. Wind swept through St. Mary Mead with a low, mournful sound, bending the trees near the churchyard and rattling loose shutters across the village. Most sensible people stayed indoors, doors locked, curtains drawn tight. Nobody wished to be outside near St. Mary's Church after dark, not anymore. But inside the church, candles were already burning. Miss Marple stood quietly near the altar while Inspector Graves waited beside the entrance with 2 constables. Reverend Colby looked exhausted, his collar loose around his neck and sweat glistening across his forehead despite the cold air. "You know why we're here," said Miss Marple gently. The Reverend said nothing. For a long moment only the wind could be heard moving through the old stone building. Then Miss Marple stepped towards the altar and rested her hand against the scratched section of floor. "Raymond Pike discovered the truth, and it frightened him badly enough to kill him." Inspector Graves frowned slightly. "You still believe he died of shock?" "I do," replied Miss Marple. "Some men can carry guilt for years, others collapse the very moment it returns to face them." Reverend Colby suddenly turned away. Miss Marple watched him carefully. "Your father buried Clara Whittemore beneath this church 20 years ago, didn't he?" The Reverend's breathing caught sharply. Outside, thunder rolled across the village. "She was pregnant, young, frightened, and involved with a wealthy married man from the village. A scandal like that would have ruined several respectable names. Your father helped cover it up after she died." "She fell," whispered the Reverend suddenly. The words came out broken. "She struck her head in the cellar steps. It was an accident." Inspector Graves stared at him. "But you hid her body," he said coldly. Tears filled the Reverend's eyes. "My father panicked. The man involved was powerful. Everyone feared disgrace more than sin in those days." He laughed bitterly under his breath. "Truth be told, they still do." Miss Marple remained calm. "And Raymond Pike discovered the hidden records." The Reverend nodded slowly. "He found letters, old church papers. He came here that night, demanding money to keep silent." His voice trembled violently now. "But when I showed him the cellar, when he saw what was truly beneath this church—" He stopped. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. "He became terrified," he whispered. "He kept saying the dead were watching him. Then suddenly he clutched his chest and collapsed." Silence filled the church. Inspector Graves removed his hat slowly. One of the constables moved towards the altar as the Reverend sank weakly into a pew, his face buried in his hands. Miss Marple looked towards the dark-stained windows high above them. The village had hidden its ugliness for decades beneath polite smiles and Sunday prayers, but ugly things had a habit of rising eventually, like damp through old walls or bones beneath stone floors. An hour later, workers carefully lifted the altar stones, and there, beneath the church of St. Mary Mead, they found Clara Whittemore at last. The bells began ringing just before midnight, not slow this time, not mournful, almost peaceful. Miss Marple stood alone near the church gate as rain drifted softly through the dark. Inspector Graves approached beside her and lit a cigarette with tired hands. "You were right again," he muttered. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Human nature is rarely original." The inspector glanced back towards the church. "Funny thing, though, villages like this always seem so quiet." "Oh," said Miss Marple softly, "quiet villages usually hide the loudest sins." the church bells echoed once more through the sleeping streets of St. Mary Mead, and somewhere, far beyond the rain and darkness, another secret was already awaiting to be uncovered. If you enjoyed tonight's mystery, do leave a like, subscribe, and step carefully back into the shadows for the next Miss Marple case, because in villages like these, nobody's innocence lasts forever.